Greetings, everyone. It is an honor to present my research during this ninth International ISOCM conference. My presentation is titled Malankara Atmosphere, Musicking and Chorality in the Malankara Orthodox Church, and this research recently culminated into a master's thesis for my choral conducting degree at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in Minneapolis. I'd like to begin with a brief introduction to what Malankara Orthodox Christianity is. So, generally speaking, it is a denomination under a larger tree of Indian Christianity. And Indian Christianity began because St. Thomas, the apostle, came to India in the year AD 52 and converted several communities there. So, over the course of almost 2,000 years now, with some influences from Portuguese, Dutch, British, and some other nations, we have almost 2,000 years of Indian Christianity and a community of St. Thomas Christians. Most Indian Christians in India practice in the southwestern state of Kerala, and there's over 30 million Indian Christians in India alone today. So I am speaking on the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, which is just one branch of many in Indian Christianity. My presentation doesn't exactly intend to cover the history of Indian Christian music because several scholars have already written on such a topic, including Dr. Joseph Balikil from the Indian Catholic Church and Reverend Father Dr. M.P. George from the Indian Orthodox Church, so the same denomination that I am from. Turning to my own research, I'd like to start by playing a brief clip from a Malankara Orthodox communion service known by the Syriac word kurbana, which means offering. This clip is from a recent live stream and shows a moment in service towards the end when after communion has been served.
May the mercies of our great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ, be upon the bearers of these holy mysteries, upon their donors, upon their receivers, upon all those who have labored and partaken of them, or are to partake of them. May the same mercy of God be upon us and upon them, in both worlds forever.
Amen. Lord, have mercy upon us. Lord, be kind and have mercy. Answer, Lord, and have mercy. Glory be to you, O Lord. Glory be to you, O Lord. Glory be to your hope forever. Glory be to God on high. Honor be to his mother.
So, musically speaking, I did not provide any context before playing this video, and that was intentional. But now that we've seen this clip, I'd like to bring attention to a few things. So, we see even in this clip that's a minute long, we see a continuous presence of singing and chanting. So, even the congregation saying Amen or saying some prayers, they will chant it, and they chant it in relation to how the priest chooses to chant, how he chooses to inflect. In this service, they're praying in English, and we can see just from this frame alone, there's a certain hierarchy. So we see two priests here, based on their garments, you can tell, but only one has assumed the lead role, and the other is more, in this case, hierarchically, like an altar boy. So he's holding the candle to liturgically support. And of course, this is a live stream, so we can focus on the frame of this in terms of what you can see, because remember, this is a live stream. And so, how do people engage in this stream? It really depends on how the frame is set and how the technology is set up to what you can hear. So, you hear people in the congregation, but you cannot see them in this particular frame of the stream. These elements seem like arbitrary observations, but they're specific to this church on this day with these specific people. As you'll see later on, we're going to watch some other clips that show other churches practicing the exact same moment liturgically in the Kurbana, but they do different things, and it affects how we engage even as we watch the videos. I've titled the presentation Malankara Atmosphere because I want to get at something deeper than service level observations. I want to explore the deeper functions and reasons for these certain practices within Indian Orthodox services and what those practices inform us about the ideals for those involved. So, more than just saying there is singing and chanting, I want to explore why that's the case and what effect that has in worship for those involved. In essence, I want to answer the question, what's really going on here? And such a question needs more context to be fully understood, and I'm deriving this question from the late ethnomusicologist Christopher Small and his influential theory of musicking. He says to music is to take part in any capacity in a musical performance by performing, listening, rehearsing, practicing, providing material, composing, or by dancing. So, this is a very monumental concept because he redefines musical engagement as a process of evolving relationships between everyone and everything involved, rather than as an object of sound or notation. So the music is no longer just something that is in one particular location or in an object such as sheet music. Everyone is involved in a verb, the process of musicking. We can think of this through a progression of questions. So instead of asking what is the meaning of this music, we ask what does it mean when this performance of this work takes place at this time in this place with these participants. So specificity really matters here to answer the question what's really going on here. And so we have a set of first order relationships among the sounds being made, among the people taking part, and among the people and the space that they occupy. So this is what's really going on here, is that every musicking setting has relationships developing. These are called the first order because you can consider them as three main pillars, and between them you have second order relationships between relationships, third order, and so on. And all of this happens at the same time, all of these developing relationships. He calls this the language of gesture. Christopher Small does, that is. And so in his book, he elaborates extensively on a case study of the Western symphonic setting. You know, the separation between a performer and audience, the audience etiquette, how a space may be set up. This is all important to how the musicking goes on in that particular setting, but the concepts transfer to any musicking setting. And through this web of relationships, we can conceptualize a sense of atmosphere. Friedrich Riedel, the German musicologist, defines atmosphere as a feeling, mood, or Stimmung that fundamentally exceeds an individual body and instead pertains primarily to the overall situation in which bodies are entrenched. Or we can think of it as Leo Spitzer puts it, something characteristic which distinguishes one place from another. So in this sense, notes Riedel, atmosphere changes from a meteorological concept to a mariological one, where all elements in a musicking setting influence the collective, and thus each element can only be viewed in relation to everything else, not as a separate entity. So it's different from saying elements add up in sort of a mathematical equation. So in the first clip we watched, we cannot say the singing and chanting and then the mics, or we cannot look at it separately. We have to think of them in relation to every other element that we can observe and that goes on there. But relationships in a musicking setting are not vacuous. Instead, they represent a set of ideals and expectations for those involved. Christopher Small states the relationships articulated by a musical performance are not so much those that actually exist as they are the relationships that those taking part desire to exist. But of course, relationships can sometimes deviate from expectations and ideals. And so, in this sense, notes Friedrich Riedel, when there occur such deviations, they can potentially collapse the entire atmosphere. What matters here is not simply that elements can vary, but specifically how they vary in relation to existing ideals and expectations of the congregation. Ultimately, anything from a change in order of service to a priest saying things differently, anything from major to minor in terms of deviation can potentially collapse an atmosphere. So I will elaborate on this as we turn to my own research of the Malankara Orthodox atmosphere. I asked the question, what are some of the relationships that can exist within such an atmosphere, and what expectations result from them? What I have discovered and what I will argue here is that the Malankara Orthodox atmosphere is uniquely immersive and envelops participants to actively participate through mostly singing and chanting. An exploration of this atmosphere must begin with what Philip Visanethu notes as uninterrupted musicality. And this is something we observed briefly in the first clip. So on average, the communion service or kurbana or most Indian Orthodox service has could be an it could be 1 hour long, it could be 7 hours long, depending on the type of service. But the point is, most of the service is filled with singing and chanting. So as we saw in the opening video, even congregational responses such as Amen are chanted, contributing to this continuous presence of musicality. But let me be clear to note that uninterrupted musicality is not the same as nonstop singing or chanting, because even in normal circumstances, there are moments where there is no singing and chanting, such as the sermon or select announcements. The point is that these points of spoken word are deliberate, but the spoken word is routinely avoided otherwise. So there's instances where the priest will be praying and need to gesture to an altar boy, and the priest during the prayer may not decide to stop the prayer and say something verbally, just to keep this sense of musicality and spirituality, even though it's not non-stop. When we look at this sense of an environment that emphasizes singing and chanting over speaking, it's apparent that the method of vocality chosen is more important than the particularities of the text alone. So I've discovered that this presence of continuous musicality serves to heighten worship and envelop participants in a state of spirituality. So we have a whole congregation of people singing and chanting and participating. So in other words, it's cyclical. So as a group of people sing and chant, it envelops them continuously and encourages them. So it's kind of this paradoxical, cyclical type of action of musicking. But it's important to note that while you can look at a congregation and easily say every single person is actively participating, at the individual level, people alternate between active and passive. So, in this sense, active, I mean vocally participating, actually singing and chanting, and participating in the gesture of cross or whatever is specific to a time frame. And then passive may be just being there, but not exactly vocally participating. And so individuals waver on this continuum. Even myself, sometimes during the same service, sometimes I'll be singing something and sometimes I won't. So people alternate and between this sense of a many in one and one for many continuum that Stephen Connor notes as part of the choric voice, a collective voice which is not attributable to any singular person, yet at the same time is not disembodied. So Stephen Connor is the one that notes the term chorality, which is a sense of looking at sound expanding within the space it contains and expanding to be in the space that it contains. So my point here is that individual states are also important within this sense of a collective. And going back to this idea of relationships, recall that we have those between sounds, people, and spaces. To get a little more specific, here are some pictures from my own church in Dallas, St. Mary's Orthodox Veliapalli in Farmers Branch, Texas. Although these are just images, there is already a lot we can discern about what is happening here before listening to any sound at all. So notice the grandeur of this particular space. It holds a lot of people. You see there's a particular way the people are arranged in that men are generally on one side, women are on another. Certain people may have mics that are not in the altar, and there's a hierarchy to how people arrange themselves. And even outside of the actual service time and space, people arrange themselves in certain ways for function. So there's a sense of community even outside the actual service. The elements have changed. Of course, they can change over time. So these pictures are just a snapshot in time. Of course, that's what pictures are. But the layout and variations matter. So, for example, while I say men on one side, women on another, it may be that a mother chooses to sit with her younger son in the male section, or a father with his daughter in the women's section. All these variations matter depending on how people expect them, and certain variations can be disruptive to an individual with their spiritual meditative state. Going more elaborately with this case study in Malankara Orthodox Church, the next two clips show the same point in the Kurbana that was showed in the opening clip of this presentation. That is, towards the end of service, after communion has been served and the priest is blessing the body and blood of Christ, So pay attention to how the priest chants and how the congregation responds, along with any other musicking elements you might find relevant in these two clips.
വലിയവനും നമ്മുടെ രക്ഷകനുമായ യേശുമിശിഹായ ദൈവത്തിന്റെ കരുണ ഈ വിശുദ്ധതകൾ വഹിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നവരുടെ മേലും ഇത് നൽകുന്നവരുടെ മേലും ഇത് അനുഭവിക്കുന്നവരുടെ മേലും പരിശ്രമിച്ച ഇതിൽ സംബന്ധിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളവരും സംബന്ധിക്കുന്നവരുമായ എല്ലാവരുടെ മേലും ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കണമേ. ദൈവത്തിന്റെ കരുണ നമ്മുടെ മേലും അവരുടെ മേലും രണ്ട് ലോകങ്ങളിലും എന്നും എന്നേക്കും ചൊരിയപ്പെടുമാറാകട്ടെ.
ഞങ്ങളുടെ പരിഹാരത്തിനും പാപങ്ങളുടെ മോചനത്തിനും ഞങ്ങളുടെ കർത്താവ് എന്നേക്കും ഞങ്ങളുടെ ദൈവമേ തിരുമുൻപാകെയുള്ള മുഖപ്രസന്നതയ്ക്കും വേണ്ടി വിലയേറിയതായ നിന്റെ തിരുശരീര രക്തങ്ങൾ അനുഭവിച്ചിരിക്കുന്ന ഈ നിന്റെ ആരാധകരുടെ സംഘത്തെ അദൃശ്യമായ നിന്റെ വലത്ത് കൈ നീട്ടി വാഴ്ത്തണമേ. ദൈവമായ കർത്താവേ, ഈ വിശുദ്ധതകൾ വഹിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നവരുടെ മേലും ഇവ നൽകുന്നവരുടെ മേലും ഇവ അനുഭവിക്കുന്നവരുടെ മേലും പരിശ്രമിച്ചതിൽ സംബന്ധിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള എല്ലാവരുടെ മേലും ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കട്ടെ. ദൈവത്തിൻ്റെ കരുണ നമ്മുടെ മേലും അവരുടെ മേലും രണ്ട് ലോകങ്ങളിലും എന്നും എന്നേക്കും ചൊരിയപ്പെടുമാറാകട്ടെ. സ്തുതി ദൈവത്തെ ഉയരത്തിൽ.
In these clips, there are, of course, a number of striking observations we can make, similarities and differences, of course. Some of the similarities you may note in both cases, an altar boy is holding a mic to the priest. The settings are more elaborate in the settings of the altar, the ornamentation of the actual building. There is instrumentation in these two videos. There's a keyboard accompanying the congregation in comparison to the opening clip, which did not have any. And a key difference you may note, for example, is that in the first clip, you hear a very brief kind of piano interlude before the hymn begins. Da, 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 da. But in the second clip, you hear the priest go straight into it. So he's chanting and then all of a sudden, Studi Devatin. And of course, there is the element of videography. So these are both live streams as well. You can take note that they are more elaborate than the first one, and that there's multiple camera angles. The audio quality is a bit more involved, and there's a different way of miking the priest. So all these differences matter again to how we engage. And in the case of the priest beginning the hymn, that's one key difference we can note. In the first one, the piano intro may make it easier for the congregants to jump in right away on beat and sing appropriately, whereas in the second one, the priest kind of dived in what I would guess is in an unexpected way, because the congregation and the pianist did not sing along right away with the priest. So that could be a moment of potential disruption for some. And so, concluding, I'd like to note the research of ethnomusicologist Jeffers Engelhardt. In his research on the Estonian Orthodox Church, he's coined the phrase right singing, which is a sense of saying poetics of singing were indelibly bound to place and community and are inseparable from complex histories and identity concerns, so the practices are particular to the place. Yet in any setting, what's most important is what the relationships lead to, the ideals and values that relationships both instill and imply through their existence inform us on why such relationships exist in the first place. The Malankara atmosphere can be one that is uniquely immersive and meditative, but this too is a result of relationships established and their consequent expectations. For the Malankara Orthodox Church, I've shown some of these relationships through a minor case study rather than attempt to classify what they mean for the entirety of a Malankara Orthodox community that is vast. In truth, the amount of variances is innumerable from church to church, community to community, person to person, and moment to moment, all at the same time. So, really, with our original question, when we ask what's really going on here, the answer is everything. Thank you.